John McCain is someone, as you said at the top of the show, who would rather lose an election than lose a war. Donald Trump is someone who is at open war with the intelligence community. He just stripped the security clearance from John Brennan. I know you signed a letter in defense of John Brennan. How dangerous is the treading on national security for an American president right now?
Well, it's concerning, but I would point out, I think, that the institutions are very strong and very robust.
Really, Rod Rosenstein doesn't know if he has a job from
Well, you may look at the Department of Justice differently, but the institutions with which I have experience, the military and the intelligence community, very professional. And there are obviously no political appointees in the military ranks. Obviously, there are in the Secretary of Defense office and so forth. But in the intelligence community, in the CIA, there's only one political appointee who matters, the director of the CIA, who right now is a professional. These are organizations that keep their head down, that tell truth to power. They're not going to shrink from that, but they're going to keep on doing their job. And I have enormous confidence in each of those institutions. Again, I'll leave it to others when it comes to the Department of Justice and the challenges that they face right now.
Far be it from me to question your assessment, but does it give you any pause to see people who are as familiar as you are with those agencies, like General Hayden, like John Brennan, like George Tenet, who also signed that letter, really sounding the alarm and feeling that it is almost un-American to have a president disparage some of those institutions that have always sort of been on the other side of the red line of political discourse?
Well, we signed the letter, and it should be read very carefully because a number of us, George and I and others, have not been ones who have been out on domestic issues, that we tend to focus on the areas that we know. And what struck us in this case, and what galvanized all of us, was a seeming attempt to, number one, to stifle the freedom of speech. You know, I was criticized very, very many times in uniform and so forth. And after one particular case where a full-page ad was taken out against me on the big day of the biggest testimony ever, the 6-month mark of the surge, the next day I was asked how I felt about that, and I said, you know, I feel very proud to have defended the right of others to exercise free speech, even if it means criticizing me. I obviously didn't applaud it. But again, and that's the way I feel about it in general, and it's that someone would seem to want to impede that or to intimidate others. That was what bothered us, and that's what led us to do that. Again, whether or not all the signers agreed with what John Brennan has said or the profile or what have you, in fact, it said dash dash and not all do, we all were united in that particular issue. And that's, I think, what really mattered there. Again, though, I had 37 years in one of them and then was the head of the other. I think these institutions are very, very strong. And I think they will very much endure.
I want to just tell our viewers, I remember that day. There was an ad, I believe it was paid for by MoveOn.org.
Yes,
they called you General Betray Us. It was 2006, is that right?
2007, it was the 6-month mark of the surge. Ambassador Crocker and I were in Washington that day. We were going to testify before the House and Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees.
I guess the distinction I would draw between that, which was inexcusable, I believe I was in the White House at the time, and I remember that. It was that at the time crossed a red line, is that the attacks now are coming from an American president. Is there anything in the attacks on the Justice? General Hayden calls them the evidence-based sciences, the media, the Justice Department, the intelligence community, and science. And is there anything, as someone who has served our country and has worked has run these agencies, that gives you pause about his skepticism about evidence-based practices?
Oh, this gives me pause without question. I mean, facts are facts. So again,
they are. Rudy doesn't think so.
No, again, so there's some degree of difference here, obviously. But you were asking me about the strength of the institutions, and again, I think these are very, very strong institutions. With centuries of history and tradition and so forth. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us and so forth, and therefore stand very tall. And by the way, many will say that about the Senate standing on the shoulders of John McCain. And, you know, I might want to point out here, a lot of people, I think, are already saying that he is the irreplaceable man and so on, and there is much to this. I mean, you can't look out there and see another Senator McCain right now, but I think he would be the first to say that there will be others. And it may be the crop of, again, America's new greatest generation members, these young men and women who volunteered at a time of war and served our country. Whether or not the country agreed with the policies, these individuals are extraordinary. And now they are seeking to continue their service, many of them now looking at politics for the first time.
Do you agree with John McCain's assessment that the Helsinki meeting was a tragic mistake? That's what he called it.
Well, there were a lot of description for it, and certainly that would be one of them. Yeah, I mean, again, there were others, and so
But
yeah.
you agree with that one?
Yeah, sure.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.